Good evening. So, this is my thought book. Here I have been writing down some questions this summer that I've just been sitting on and pondering. And it's been quite interesting, quite interesting. One thing that I've really given a lot of thought to is courage. It's just been kind of on my mind a lot this summer, and I've been pondering what does it mean to be courageous? And I was inspired to sort of go in this direction by this book that I read this summer. It's called Stepping Up, A Call to Courageous Manhood by Dennis Rainey. Now, I will admit that I got quite a few strange looks when I was reading this book and people were asking what I was reading. I'd show them and they kind of make a face, or they'd say, "Oh, doesn't that promote like the I don't even know what the terminology is, like unhealthy gender normatives or stereotypes?" And no, it doesn't. This is largely just a book about being courageous. It does talk about, specifically in regards to manhood, how important it is for men to take the courageous call to step up and be fathers, because we notice a lot in our culture these days, men that are abandoning their families, that are not living up to the call to truly be courageous. Because being a parent is not an easy thing. I mean, I haven't been one myself, but I understand that it takes a lot of courage to raise a family, to have those tough discussions, to discipline. This book also talks about the courageous step of getting married. In our culture, a lot we see a hesitancy of young men to get married and just not step up to that courageous call to commit. Also, a very interesting thing in this book was the discussion on the word teenager, how the whole concept of a teenager didn't really, well, it didn't exist until, I want to say, one of the earlier on in the 20th century, that this term was invented. And with it, as society, we've kind of given a pass for teenagers to act a fool. Like, a young man might be doing something foolish, something irresponsible, and we just dismiss it as, "Oh, he's just a teenager," as if that sort of behavior is acceptable and dismissible simply because of age. And the alarming thing is we have extended that sort of permittance or dismissal past the actual teenage years into 20s, even into 30s. And this book is really calling people to be responsible for your actions, be courageous in your dealings with others and in your life. So, if you find those sort of things negative, well, then perhaps. But I found this book to be awesome. And the author, he leads some conferences, and he was expressing in his book how he often doesn't have the desire for small talk anymore. He kind of just jumps right into the serious questions. And he likes to ask the men at his conferences, "What's the most courageous thing you have ever done?" And so that question I've been sitting on all summer long, and it's quite an interesting one to ask other people. And when we unpack this question, first it's important that we have a common understanding of what courageous means, because different people are going to define courage or being courageous differently. Dennis, in his book, he defines courage as something you do in the face of fear or the requirement of sacrifice. Essentially, those aren't his exact words, but he's saying, like, you can't do something courageous unless you are facing a fear or you're facing a risk or sacrifice. I agree. But then I also think there's another aspect which he doesn't really define, but I believe is kind of, you can kind of find this in between the lines. But I believe courage, if we're going to define it, has a connotation of doing something for someone else or for greater good. Courage is facing fear or sacrifice not to benefit yourself, but to benefit other people. Because when he first mentioned, what is the most courageous thing you have ever done, I was thinking about what's something I did that despite like the fear. And I think back of when I was just 19 and I went as an international student to study in Mexico. And on that airplane flight to Mexico, I was really quite afraid because I didn't know like who was picking me up at the airport exactly, how everything was going to work out. Like it was a lot of fear there, but I went regardless and studied. But that was for my own selfish interest. Like I wanted to study in Mexico. I faced that fear for my own self-improvement. But when I'm considering the question, what's the most courageous thing you do, I think about for others. You're facing fear, sacrifice for greater good for others. And so that's really challenging because I don't know if I have a good answer for what's the most courageous thing you do. I know some people would say, oh, you go on all of these trips and do all these hikes and adventures. That takes a lot of courage. And I would say, no, that really isn't courage. Maybe it's adventurous. Maybe it's brave. But really, those are kind of pursuing my own selfish interest. So I'm not sure that I would define those things as courageous. This summer, when I was working at the Polbridge Mercantile in Montana, one thing I discovered that I liked to do was just in the morning time before I went in for my shift, I would get my coffee or tea and a cinnamon roll and sit there on the porch and just talk with whoever was around. And there's a local elderly man who joined me on the porch, and we were talking about courage. And it was interesting to get his perspective. He was saying the most courageous thing he did was kind of leave everything he had behind in his life. Like he sold his house and a lot of his possessions and just took off for this remote reach of Montana to live. And his friends all thought he was crazy, but he thought it was a very courageous thing to do. And again, you know, maybe that's a brave thing to do. Maybe that's a risky, adventurous thing to do. But how did that benefit others? What sacrifice were you making for another? Or was it just for yourself? And so this is a challenge. This is a challenge to really think about being courageous. And one thing that Dennis discusses in his book too is that in today's society and culture, there are a lot of things that are just being degraded and flat out attacked. Principles and moral beliefs that we find sacred are just being degraded so much in society and in media, and it takes courage for people to stand up and say, hey, this is not right. There has been an increasing call, and I am going to say specifically to men, to just kind of shut up and be passive and stay in the background. Don't stir the pot. But this passivity has been detrimental to society. We need courageous men that will stand up and will speak out when things aren't right. And it doesn't apply just to men. It really applies to anyone. But that's the real call to courage that I'm being challenged with. If something is wrong, and I just don't mean like different, tolerating differences is a good thing. But when we see moral principles attacked and degraded, that is when we need to say something. And it's risky. And, there's an aspect of fear in there because people are going to may retaliate. People may think you're stuck up, may, pass lots of judgment on you. You can lose acceptance in friendships, relationships, over really standing up for what you believe in. But in the end, it's worth it. And you got to ask yourself, are you going to be a courageous person, or are you just going to be a passive person that just flows with the whims of society? There was one instance this summer when I did decide to speak up on something that I felt was wrong. And I'm not going to go into the details of it because I want to be respectful for everyone involved. But there was something I just felt was wrong. And I spoke up about it. And I knew that it probably wouldn't go over so well. And it was risky and how other people would perceive me afterwards. And I was really afraid that I was going to be hated by other people. And in the end, it was quite the contrary. Is not that I caused people to hate me, but I caused people to have more respect for me and honor me. And so that was quite interesting. It wasn't the result that I expected. And also taking this like a little bit further, this concept of courage. And I don't have like a definitive answer for this, but I just like to raise this question is, let's say there are two people that are facing the same exact situation, and one is really afraid and the other is not afraid. Is the person facing that situation with fear more courageous than the person that faces that situation without fear? It's interesting to think about. Do you have to be afraid to be courageous? Or can courage be a built-in quality? I don't know. It's an abstract concept to kind of ponder. Because courage has also, a positive connotation in that like a courageous person is like such a good person, and like got two people doing the exact same thing. Just because one was afraid, does that make him the courageous one and a better person? Or can we perceive the person that faced it without the fear did the same thing? Can we view them in the same light? And that is something to really unpack. But the challenge is for you and for myself is like, what are you doing in your life that is courageous? Or what is the most courageous thing you have ever done? I would start there. What is the most courageous thing you have ever done? And maybe you'll come to the same conclusion I have, which is, I don't think I've been that courageous, but I'm challenged. I'm challenged to be more courageous. And I am challenged to be courageous in standing up for what I believe. And, if there are other opportunities for courage, to really be able to identify them and pursue them, because that is something that I want to cultivate, and something I want to be identified with in my life is someone that is courageous. Well, those are my thoughts this time. I have plenty more. Maybe I'll introduce you to some more of my thoughts another time. But thanks for watching. Have a good night.